The steel cable snapped tight around the faded blue pickup truck with a metallic clang that echoed across the quiet corporate plaza. "Lift it." CEO Victoria Hayes never raised her voice. She didn't have to. The tow truck operator pulled the lever, and the truck's front wheels slowly left the ground. 20 feet away, the truck's owner didn't protest. He simply stood there, one hand holding a worn leather toolbox, the other resting gently on the shoulder of his 8-year-old daughter. The little girl looked up at him. "Dad, are they taking Mom's truck?" For the first time that morning, his eyes closed only for a second. "Yeah, sweetheart." "Are you going to stop them?" He forced a small smile. "No." "But why?" He looked at the building towering above them, 40 stories of glass reflecting the morning sun. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "people tell you who they are before they ever learn who you are." The girl didn't understand. She simply slipped her small hand into his. Inside the lobby, executives walked past expensive marble floors without noticing the father and daughter outside. Except one woman, Victoria Hayes, the youngest CEO in the company's history, known across Wall Street for making billion-dollar decisions in minutes. She glanced through the revolving doors, saw the old pickup being loaded onto the tow truck, and nodded once to security. "Make sure it's gone before our guests arrive." "Yes, ma'am." She never looked at the man again. She didn't notice the little girl wiping away tears. She didn't notice the faded military service sticker on the truck's rear window. And she certainly didn't notice the small wooden box sitting carefully strapped in the truck bed. Inside that box was something worth far more than the truck itself. 30 minutes later, the executive boardroom buzzed with nervous excitement. A $3.4 billion acquisition would be signed before noon. Every board member was already seated. Every legal document had been reviewed. Every investor was waiting. Victoria entered confidently. "Let's make history." Then the chief legal officer cleared his throat. "There may be a problem." Victoria frowned. "What kind of problem?" "The acquisition agreement contains a risk model none of us can fully explain." Silence settled over the room. "We've reviewed it 5 times," the attorney continued. "It wasn't written by an ordinary financial team." One analyst at the end of the table slowly raised his hand. His voice barely rose above a whisper. "I think I know who designed it." Every head turned toward him. Victoria folded her arms. "Then tell us." The analyst swallowed. "There's only one person I've ever met who could build or expose something like this." "Who?" He hesitated, then quietly spoke a name. "Ethan Brooks." Victoria stared blankly. "I've never heard of him." The analyst's face turned pale. "You have." He looked toward the window overlooking the parking plaza. "You had his truck towed less than an hour ago." The silence inside the boardroom became almost unbearable. Victoria Hayes stared at the young analyst. "You expect me to postpone a $3.4 billion acquisition because of a man driving a 20-year-old pickup?" No one answered. Daniel Foster, the youngest financial analyst in the room, took a slow breath. "It isn't the truck that matters." Victoria folded her arms. "Then what does?" Daniel looked around the room before speaking. 5 years ago, every major investment bank on Wall Street was talking about one person. He paused. His name was Ethan Brooks. Several older board members exchanged uneasy glances. Richard Lawson, the company's chairman, slowly removed his reading glasses. "I remember him." Victoria turned toward him. "You do?" Richard nodded. "I've never met him, but I've read his work." Daniel continued. "They called him the man who could see financial traps before anyone else. He wasn't famous because he made companies money. He was famous because he stopped companies from losing billions." The room grew quiet again. Victoria frowned. "If he was that valuable, why have I never heard his name?" Daniel hesitated. "Because he disappeared." Across town, Ethan Brooks pulled his old pickup into the driveway of a small white house on the edge of Cedar Hill. The truck rattled as he turned off the engine. His daughter, Lily, climbed out holding her backpack. "Dad." "Yeah. Are you sad?" He smiled a little. "Because of the truck?" "No." She tilted her head. "Then why?" He looked toward the empty porch where his wife used to sit every Saturday morning with a cup of coffee. "It's just one of those days that reminds you how quickly people judge what they don't understand." Lily quietly wrapped her arms around him. I know who you are. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he hugged her back, and that's enough. Inside the house, the furniture was simple. Nothing expensive, nothing flashy, every table, every bookshelf. Every chair had been built by Ethan himself. His late wife had loved working with wood. After cancer took her 3 years earlier, he never sold the workshop. He simply kept building, sometimes furniture, sometimes toys. Sometimes hospital beds for children whose families couldn't afford them. He never accepted payment from the hospital. He simply dropped them off before sunrise and disappeared before anyone could thank him. Even Lily didn't know how many families her father had quietly helped. To her, he was simply Dad. Back inside Carter Global's headquarters, Victoria paced near the conference room windows. This acquisition moves forward today. Richard Lawson slowly stood. It won't. She turned sharply. What? If Ethan Brooks says there's something wrong with this agreement. He looked directly into her eyes. Then I won't sign a single page until he tells us it's safe. Victoria blinked. You trust a stranger over our entire legal department. Richard's voice remained calm. No. I trust the man who saved my previous company from bankruptcy 12 years ago. Victoria froze. You know him. Richard nodded once. He has no idea who I am. He saved us and walked away without asking for $1. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. For the first time that morning, she wondered whether the man whose truck she had ordered towed was far more extraordinary than anyone in the building had realized. Victoria Hayes had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without losing her composure. She had testified before congressional committees. She had faced activist investors, hostile takeovers, and economic crashes. Yet somehow, one quiet man in a faded denim jacket had unsettled her more than any of them ever had. She picked up her phone. Find Ethan Brooks. Her executive assistant looked confused. Ma'am, there are over 600 Ethan Brooks in the state. Victoria's voice stayed calm. The one driving an old blue pickup. That's not much to go on. Then start with the towing company. 20 minutes later, the tow company sent over the paperwork. Vehicle owner, Ethan James Brooks. Address, a small neighborhood on the eastern side of the city. Victoria grabbed her coat. I'm going myself. The board members exchanged surprised looks. The chairman finally smiled. In 15 years. I've never seen you leave a board meeting unfinished. Victoria answered without turning around. Neither have I. Across town, Ethan wasn't thinking about Carter Global anymore. To him, that chapter of the morning was already over. His focus was somewhere else. Lily. Ready? His daughter smiled. Always. The old pickup rolled through downtown before stopping outside St. Anne's Children's Hospital. Volunteers immediately walked outside. Mr. Brooks. You made it. A nurse hurried over, smiling warmly. We were afraid today's delivery had been canceled. Ethan smiled. Took a little longer than expected. He quietly opened the truck bed. Inside were handcrafted wooden activity tables, tiny rocking horses, puzzle stations, reading shelves. Everything had been built by hand. Lily proudly helped carry one small bookshelf inside. A little boy connected to an IV pole looked at it with wide eyes. Did you make that? Lily nodded proudly. My dad did. The little boy slowly smiled. It's awesome. Ethan didn't stay to hear the compliments. He never did. As the volunteers unloaded the last piece, he quietly walked back toward the parking lot. One nurse stopped him. Mr. Brooks. He turned. You've donated furniture here for almost 3 years. We've tried to thank you. We've tried to pay you. You always disappear. Ethan smiled gently. My wife spent her last 6 months in this hospital. The nurse's smile faded. She told me something before she passed. He looked toward the children's wing. If you ever have the chance to leave a place a little kinder than you found it, don't wait for someone to ask. So, I don't. Without another word, he climbed into the pickup. The nurse stood there silently, watching him drive away. At that exact moment, Victoria's black sedan pulled into the hospital entrance. She stepped out just as several volunteers were waving goodbye to Ethan's truck. One volunteer smiled. You just missed him. Victoria looked toward the road. The man in the blue pickup. Yes, do you know him? The volunteer laughed softly. Only enough to know Victoria didn't realize she was still holding the wooden plaque until her phone began vibrating. The screen flashed. Richard LAWSON. She answered immediately. Richard. His voice was unusually tense. Where are you? St. Anne's Children's Hospital. A brief silence followed. You need to come back. What happened? The acquisition. Victoria's heartbeat quickened. What about it? Our outside legal team just called. They found inconsistencies. Victoria frowned. I thought our attorneys had already cleared everything. They did, but Ethan Brooks was right. Victoria felt the words land like a weight in her stomach. What exactly did they find? Richard spoke carefully. The agreement contains a hidden liability clause. If we sign it, Carter Global could inherit nearly $1.2 billion in environmental lawsuits. Victoria stopped walking. That's impossible. Our lawyers missed it. Our consultants missed it. Our auditors missed it. But Ethan somehow recognized the structure after seeing only a few pages. Victoria slowly looked toward the road where Ethan's truck had disappeared. Richard. How did he know? I don't know, but we need him. 15 minutes later, the Carter Global boardroom looked completely different from that morning. The excitement was gone. Stacks of legal documents covered the conference table. Outside attorneys were joining by video conference. Investors were calling every few minutes. The company's stock had already started slipping after rumors spread that the deal might be delayed. Victoria entered quietly. No one spoke. For the first time since becoming CEO, every eye in the room questioned her judgment. Richard finally broke the silence. Did you find him? She slowly shook her head. No. Daniel looked up from his laptop. The towing company said they already released his truck. Another executive sighed. We've searched every professional database. No recent interviews. No social media. No consulting business. It's like the man disappeared. Richard leaned back in his chair. No. He chose peace. There's a difference. Across town, Ethan and Lily sat on a small bench beside a quiet lake. They often came here after visiting the children's hospital. Lily skipped little stones across the water. Dad. Yeah. Are you mad at that lady? Ethan watched the ripples spread across the lake. I was. He smiled, being angry as heavy. I already carry enough. Lily thought about that for a moment. So, you forgave her. He looked at his daughter. Forgiveness doesn't mean pretending something didn't happen. It means deciding it won't control what happens next. Lily nodded slowly. I think Mom would have said that. Ethan smiled. She did. Back at Carter Global, Victoria stood alone in her office, staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her reflection looked different somehow. Less confident, more uncertain. She replayed the morning in her mind. The old truck. The little girl, the tears in her eyes, the calm expression on Ethan's face. He hadn't argued, he hadn't threatened, he hadn't even raised his voice. He had simply accepted the humiliation, as if he'd learned long ago that dignity wasn't something another person could take away. Victoria closed her eyes. When did I become this person? For years, she had believed efficiency was leadership. Results were everything. Emotions only slowed people down, but today, one quiet father had exposed something no quarterly report ever could. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing people. She had started seeing obstacles. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Daniel stepped inside. Ma'am. She looked up. I found him. Victoria's heart skipped. Where? Daniel handed her a folded envelope. It isn't an address. It's an invitation. Victoria unfolded the thick cream-colored paper. At the top, embossed in silver lettering, were the words, BROOKS Foundation. Below that, a single sentence, Annual Children's Workshop, volunteers welcome. Location, tomorrow morning. Victoria looked at Daniel. He volunteers. Daniel smiled faintly. No. He built the foundation. Victoria's eyes widened. What foundation? Daniel met her gaze. The one that's quietly funded children's hospitals, trade scholarships, and veterans' family programs for almost a decade. Without ever putting Ethan Brooks' name on a single building. Victoria could barely breathe. The man she'd treated like he didn't matter had spent years changing thousands of lives without asking for recognition. And tomorrow, she would finally have the chance to face him. But she had no idea that someone else was already planning to make sure Ethan never helped Carter Global again. The next morning, before sunrise, the Brooks Foundation workshop was already alive. The old warehouse echoed with the sound of saws, sanders, and children's laughter. Dozens of volunteers worked side by side. Retired veterans, college students, carpenters, teachers. Even a few former executives who had quietly chosen a different kind of success after meeting Ethan Brooks years earlier. No reporters, no cameras, no sponsors' banners, just people helping people, at the center of it all. Ethan was teaching a group of children how to build small wooden birdhouses. "Don't rush," he told a nervous little boy. "The strongest things are almost never built quickly." The boy smiled as Ethan gently adjusted his hands. "There. Perfect." A black luxury sedan rolled slowly into the parking lot. Victoria Hayes stepped out alone, for the first time in years. She wasn't wearing a designer red power suit. Instead, she wore simple jeans, a white shirt, and work boots. She didn't want to look like a CEO. She wanted to look like someone asking for forgiveness, taking a deep breath. She walked toward the workshop before she reached the entrance. A deep voice stopped her. "You're late." She turned. Standing beside the doorway was Richard Lawson. "You came?" Victoria asked. Richard smiled. "I've volunteered here every spring for 7 years." Victoria stared at him. "You never told anyone." Richard shrugged. "Ethan prefers it that way." Inside, Victoria watched something she never expected. The man she'd judged in less than 30 seconds knew every volunteer by name. Every child ran to him. Every veteran shook his hand like a brother. Nobody called him Mr. Brooks. Nobody called him Sir. To everyone there, he was simply Ethan, a man who showed up, again and again, without ever asking for credit. Victoria slowly walked toward him. "Ethan." He looked up from the workbench. Their eyes met. Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "I'm sorry. I judged you. I embarrassed you. I treated your daughter unfairly. And I was wrong." The workshop became quiet. Nobody stopped working, but everyone listened. Ethan placed his hammer on the table. "Thank you." Victoria looked surprised. "That's all you're going to say?" He smiled gently. "What else should I say? You admitted your mistake. That's harder than most people think." Victoria lowered her eyes. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." Ethan nodded. "Probably not." The answer caught her completely off guard. But forgiveness isn't something people earn. It's something people choose. Victoria felt tears forming. "I don't know how to fix what I did." Ethan looked around the workshop. "Start by making sure you don't do it to someone else." Before Victoria could answer, Richard's phone rang. He looked at the screen, then his expression changed instantly. He answered. "Richard Lawson." His face turned pale. "What?" The workshop fell silent. Richard slowly lowered the phone. "They've signed it." Victoria frowned. "Who?" "The acquisition." Victoria's eyes widened. "That's impossible." "I suspended the meeting." Richard looked directly at Ethan. "Someone inside Carter Global used emergency authority. The contract has already been executed." Silence. Daniel Foster came running into the workshop moments later, completely out of breath. "They tricked the board. They used electronic authorization while everyone was searching for Ethan." Victoria whispered, "No." Daniel looked straight at Ethan. The man behind it was Chief Financial Officer Mark Ellison. Richard closed his eyes. "I should have known." Daniel continued. "He personally pushed the acquisition through. And if the lawsuit clause is activated, Carter Global could collapse within 6 months." Everyone turned toward Ethan. Victoria's voice trembled. "Can we stop it?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Lily, who was helping another little girl paint a birdhouse. Then he quietly said, "I retired because I promised my daughter she'd never have to compete with a boardroom for my time again." He looked back at Victoria. "So before I answer, I need to know something." Victoria swallowed. "What?" Ethan's eyes never left hers. "If I save your company, what's going to change?" The question hung in the air. No one spoke. Because everyone realized the future of a multi-billion-dollar company no longer depended on contracts. It depended on whether one humble single father still believed it was worth saving. The workshop fell completely silent. Dozens of volunteers looked toward Ethan. Victoria stood frozen. Richard Lawson slowly stepped forward. Ethan, if there's any way to stop this, please. Ethan looked around the room. Not at the executives, not at the volunteers. At the children, they were laughing, painting birdhouses, building toy cars, completely unaware that hundreds of jobs and thousands of families might soon depend on the decision he was about to make. He took a slow breath. I'll help. Victoria closed her eyes in relief, but his voice remained calm. I won't help save a company. I'll help save the people who work for it. The words landed harder than anyone expected. 30 minutes later, the Carter Global boardroom was filled beyond capacity. Outside attorneys, federal compliance specialists, independent auditors, every board member had returned. At the end of the table sat Ethan Brooks, still wearing his faded denim shirt, still carrying the same worn leather toolbox. No expensive briefcase, no designer watch, no display of power, just quiet confidence. Across the table, Chief Financial Officer Mark Ellison smiled politely. I've heard a lot about you. Ethan smiled back. I wish I could say the same. Mark leaned back. The acquisition has already closed. Nothing can be changed now. Ethan nodded. You're right. Mark's smile grew wider. Victoria looked down. Then Ethan calmly added, but fraud can. The room went silent. Ethan opened his toolbox instead of tools. It contained neatly organized folders, old notebooks, financial diagrams, handwritten calculations. Richard smiled. You still keep paper copies. Ethan shrugged. Paper never deletes itself. A few people laughed nervously. Mark didn't. Ethan placed the acquisition agreement on the table. I noticed something yesterday. He pointed to a paragraph buried nearly 200 pages into the contract. Everyone focused on the environmental liability. They missed the signature authority. The attorneys leaned forward. Ethan continued. This clause transfers approval authority to a shell company during emergency execution. One attorney frowned. That isn't unusual. It is, Ethan replied calmly, when the shell company is secretly owned by the executive approving the transaction. Every face turned toward Mark. His smile disappeared. Victoria slowly whispered, What? Ethan slid another document across the table. This corporation, this mailing address, this tax registration, they all connect to one holding company. Richard looked closer, then looked at Mark. His face turned white. Tell me this isn't yours. Mark remained silent. The silence answered everything. Daniel hurried to his laptop. My God. It's true. The shell company traces back to an investment trust. He looked up. The beneficiary is Mark Ellison. Gasps filled the room. Victoria stared at her CFO. You were going to profit from the lawsuits. Mark finally stood. You don't understand. No, Richard interrupted. You thought we wouldn't. Federal compliance officers immediately requested the records. Mark tried to leave. Security blocked the door. You can't do this. One officer calmly replied, We're not. You did. For several long moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Victoria looked at Ethan. You saved us. 3 months later, the glass headquarters of Carter Global looked the same from the outside. But inside, everything had changed. Employees no longer needed appointments to speak with senior leadership. Every executive, including the CEO, spent 1 day each month working alongside frontline employees. The company had launched a new policy: respect every person. It wasn't just another slogan hanging on a wall. It became the standard by which every manager would be evaluated. Because one morning, an old pickup truck had reminded an entire corporation that titles never define a person's worth. Victoria Hayes stood outside the headquarters entrance, watching employees arrive for work. She noticed something she'd never paid attention to before: an elderly janitor struggling with a supply cart. She walked over. Can I help? The man smiled, surprised. You don't have to do that. Victoria smiled back. I know. But I want to. Several employees quietly watched. Some smiled. Others exchanged surprised glances. The woman they once feared was becoming someone they respected, not because she had become weaker, but because she had finally become human. Across town, the Brooks Foundation held its annual Family Builders Day. Hundreds of volunteers filled the workshop. Children laughed while painting toy boxes. Veterans worked beside high school students. Parents built bookshelves for local schools, just like always. There were no television cameras, no interviews, no speeches. Only people helping people. Lily ran across the workshop carrying a small wooden birdhouse. Dad, you have visitors. Ethan looked up. Victoria and Richard Lawson stood quietly at the entrance. Victoria held a carefully wrapped package. She walked toward Ethan. I owe you something. You don't owe me anything. I do. She handed him the package. Inside was a polished wooden sign, not made by a factory, made by Carter Global employees. Across the front were carefully engraved words, BROOKS Family Community Workshop. Below that, in smaller letters, built in honor of quiet acts of kindness that changed thousands of lives. Ethan stared silently. Victoria spoke softly. You spent years helping people without asking for recognition. I know this sign doesn't repay that. It never could. But I hope it reminds every child who walks through these doors that kindness leaves a legacy no amount of money can buy. For a long moment, Ethan simply looked at the sign, then at Lily. His daughter smiled. I think Mom would have loved it. Ethan's eyes filled with tears. So do I. Before leaving, Victoria handed Ethan one final envelope. I have one more request. He opened it. Inside was an offer to join Carter Global as a senior strategic advisor. No executive office, no title bigger than anyone else's. No stock options, just one sentence. Help us become the company we should have been all along. Ethan smiled, then quietly closed the envelope. I appreciate it. Victoria looked hopeful, but my answer is no. She looked surprised. Ethan continued gently. I promised Lily that she would always come before boardrooms. I'm not breaking that promise. Victoria nodded. I understand. She turned to leave, then Ethan called after her. Victoria. She looked back. You don't need me. You already learned the lesson. Now teach it to everyone else. As Victoria walked toward her car, Richard smiled. You know, we almost lost a company. Victoria looked back at the workshop where children laughed around Ethan and Lily. No, she said quietly, we almost lost something much more valuable. Richard raised an eyebrow. What was that? Victoria smiled. The ability to see people before we see positions. That afternoon, an old blue pickup rolled slowly down a quiet country road. Lily looked out the window. Dad. Yeah, do you think people can really change? Ethan smiled as sunlight reflected across the windshield. They can. How? They have to decide that being right matters less than becoming better. Lily thought for a moment, then smiled. I like that. So did your mom. The truck disappeared over the hill, not carrying a billionaire, not carrying a corporate legend, just a father, keeping the only promise that had ever truly mattered. And somewhere behind them,